Welcome everybody to another episode of Sunday Morning Poetry. I just wanted to play that. I think it's going to be interesting, that song, because it's actually, well, not just the song, but the image, if you're watching on Facebook Live, is actually, I think, a little bit relevant to what we're going to talk about. But this is another episode of Sunday Morning Poetry, which is where we read and discuss a poem in lieu of going to church. And we've been, discussing this for about 5-6 weeks now. And it was inspired by a poem by Wallace Stevens called Sunday Morning, where he discusses just that prospect. So anyway, we're going to be talking about the poem The Westerner by Badger Clark, which happens to be Ayn Rand's favorite poem. And she had a statement or a quote. I'm going to quote Rand, quoting a Greek philosopher, but you can look this up. It's an interesting video interview she did on the Tom Snyder show, I think in the 70s. And so you can just Google Ayn Rand, Tom Snyder, and you'll see, you'll see this full interview where she has this quote. And it's an interesting one. And it's one that got her called Psychopath Personified on YouTube, the ever glorious YouTube, but not only called that in the comments, but actually a clip of this was pulled out where they used this quote. They turned it into a 60-second video, and they just called her Psychopath Personified. And it was really interesting. The person said, the statement that solidified my belief that Ayn Rand was a psychopath. What is he talking about? What quote is that? Well, here's the quote. And this will be relevant to The Westerner by Badger Clark. The quote is, "I will not die. It is the world that will end." Now, this was in response to Tom Snyder talking about he was hoping or desiring or likes to believe that when he dies, he's not just going to be a corpse. And this is a common theme that we hear, atheists get a lot. If you'd say that you don't believe in religion or in terms of supernatural or if you just call yourself an atheist, you're automatically, marked as some weirdo. So, and one of the things people make fun of atheists for is this idea exactly, that this idea that you're just going to become a tree. That's one thing that Dane Cook made fun of atheists for. It's like, oh, what, you're going to die and go into the earth and become a tree? Oh, la-di-da-di-da, whatever. Now, of course, this is ludicrous. This is not what atheists really believe. And Ayn Rand had a great answer to this. And her answer was that you will not be a corpse because what makes you is this animating feature within you. So the corpse part of you, the material part only, once the you part stops animating it and becomes you, you're not a corpse. You're not like sitting around after you're dead like, oh, woe is me that I'm a corpse. You're gone. And then she said there's this, in answer to this kind of idea here, she said that there's this quote that she likes, and she's known it since she was a 16-year-old girl in Russia, and she wasn't quite sure, exactly what it meant at the time, and it's taken her a whole life, and now she appreciates it even more. But the quote was that the one I read you, "I will not die. It is the world that will end." So today we're going to be discussing the poem "The Westerner" by Badger Clark. Now, the one of the cool things about this poem, do that. Yep. One of the cool things about this poem is this was Ayn Rand's favorite poem, and you'll see a little bit of her view here and why she thought what she thought about dying and I will not die. It's the world that will end. Because to really understand that, you need to have a grasp of her view of existence, reality, consciousness, and how those play together. And I think this is something that is often really confused. If possible, I'll do my best to bring in Jordan Peterson, because I've been working on my fourth grappling. I don't want to call it a lecture because I'm not qualified to give lectures, but on this topic especially, or any topic probably. But it's a grappling where I'm trying to understand what he's saying. And this is the chapter where he says you're not an atheist, which I find fascinating. And I'll just say I think I understand what he means by that as an atheist, and I think I understand why he said it. And I think if I use his terminology, if I understand how he thinks he's using his terminology, then I think he's right. and what he means by that. But there has to be a little bit of what, when you study Greek, ancient Greek philosophy or ancient Greek anything, there's something called transliteration. It's basically just taking some of the text that's, and understanding how to translate it into English verbiage so you can understand it if you're not a speaker of Greek, right? So I think there's, he's kind of using one kind of language. I have a different language, and you may have a different language. So we have to transliterate the language. We have to say, well, what does he mean by religion? What does he mean by atheism? And, he's pretty clear on what he means by that. So I think you can do that. I think you can see what he means. And, we could put it in an objectivist Rand term, because one thing that Rand, I think, did better than any philosopher that I've ever read is she really stressed the importance of defining your terms. Therefore, you get a lot of well-defined, well-thought-out, well-demarcated context was always thought, how does it fit into the whole? The best intellectuals, objectivist intellectuals, put a lot of thought into that, and Ayn Rand especially put a ton of thought into that, and she was very clear. So anyway, the point is that therefore we have these two people who are both, Peterson's not as clear as Rand, but he's pretty clear. He does a good job. And Rand is very deadly clear. Like, you can't, whether she's right or wrong, she is, if you read her corpus, you can get a good sense of her language and how she used words. And there's even you can Google a lexicon of Ayn Rand terminology or objectivist terminology, so you can see what she means and kind of cross-reference that. So anyway, the first thing I wanted to do is talk about The Westerner by Badger Clark. Now, this is a poem that's not, on the face of it, that complicated. I think you'll understand the words, at least. There's not a lot of words that are going to be like so dramatically challenging to understand that you'll never get it. But there are, but it is a great poem. I think on any standard, it's a great poem. And in fact, if you Google a little bit about it, you'll see that when it was published, it was used in a lot of books, a lot of publications. Like, it was a pretty popular poem, it seems, from what I can gather from Google Books. So let me pop this guy on the screen, and I'm going to go ahead and read it, and then we'll go stanza by stanza and discuss it. Okay, let me pull this sucker up. All right, The Westerner. My fathers sleep on the sunrise plains, and each one sleeps alone. Their trails may dim to the grass and rains, for I choose to make my own. I lay proud claim to their blood and name, but I lean on no dead kin. My name is mine for the praise or scorn, and the world began when I was born, and the world is mine to win. They built high towns on their old log sills, where the great slow rivers gleamed, but with new live rock from the savage hills, I'll build as they only dreamed. The smoke scarce dies where the trail camp lies, till the rails glint down the pass. The desert springs into fruit and wheat, and I lay the stones of a solid street over yesterday's untrod grass. I waste no thought on my neighbor's birth or the way he makes his prayer. I grant him a white man's room on earth if his game is only square. While he plays it straight, I'll call him mate. If he cheats, I'll drop him flat. Old class and rank are a worn-out lie, for all clean men are as good as I, and the king is only that. I dream no dreams of a nursemaid state that will spoon me out my food. A stout heart sings in the fray with fate, and the shock and sweat are good. From noon to noon, all the earthly boon that I ask my God to spare is a little daily bread in store, with the room to fight the strong for more. And the weak shall get their share. The sunrise plains are a tender haze, and the sunset seas are gray. But I stand here where the bright skies blaze over me and the big today. What good to me is a vague maybe, or a mournful might have been? For the sun wheels swift from morn to morn, and the world began when I was born, and the world is mine to win. Okay. So I hope you enjoyed reading that, even though I slipped up a little bit there. But the point is, or the next thing we're going to do is read through each stanza and kind of think about what's going on in the poem. But I always say before you think, before you go through something like that, you should definitely read it all the way through. I think that's a common thing that people don't do as much today. And this is a good lesson in learning, by the way. So, this is the podcast overall, and the show that I do is, this is Sunday morning poetry, but I put this in poems for people who hate poetry. So I have a whole umbrella, poems for people who hate poetry, which is really about literature for people who aren't literary professors or PhDs in literature, or, classic or normally trained in modern, studies about literature. It's, a new way to approach literature is what I'm trying to go for. And anyway, so one of the things I notice is that a lot of people have really bad tendencies in listening and reading, where the second they go into it, they want to analyze and obsess. And this is true whether you're an objectivist. I don't care. I've seen, when I was a younger objectivist, I would read anything from philosophy, from literature. I would listen to people. While they talk, and I would interrupt and kind of spew my thoughts on why they were wrong to use a term a certain way. This was especially true when people talked about art, because I was really obsessed with art. I'm still obsessed with art. I think it's more important than anything in the world. Obviously, we'll get into why I think that with this poem. And, so there's a lot, I think, related to how we each think that what we do is the most important thing on the planet. And I think there's some truth to that, because, again, if you think I will not die, it's the world that will end, or and the world began when I was born, and the world is mine to win. There's a lot of that going on. And, so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But my point is that, one tip for reading poetry is to go in and just read it naked. And that's the best way I can think about it, is go in, don't obsess about, did they get the terminology the way that you would do it? Transliterate it if you need to, and find out, okay, you disagree with their language, that's fine. But find out why they said that. Try to just listen. Listen to the poet. Listen to the author. Listen to the talk show host. Listen to the speaker. Listen to the person sitting in front of you. I mean, this is one of Jordan Peterson's rules for life, is something like, I can't remember off the top of my head how it's quoted, but it's something like, listen to the person as, listen to each person as though they have something to teach you. And I think that's a good thing, because even if you adamantly disagree, even if it's a Nazi, you should still listen, because you can think, well, why does this person think that? Why do they believe that? How is this person alive and existing and actually spouting these things? And you can discover, for instance, like Milo Yiannopoulos, who used to be a thing but's no longer a thing anymore. You can think like, well, he did a tour around campuses that was called Dangerous Fags. And I was like, what? And he got rioted and things like that. And you could say, why, he's a piece of crap. He's horrible for saying that. What's wrong with him? He's gay, by the way. And so he's talking about himself. He wasn't talking about other people. And that was part of the, and he probably had a double entendre he was going after, so he was trying to be witty and provocative. And that's the conclusion you have to make is, but the other thing is you can listen, and what can you learn from why he's doing that? And, I think you get more out of it than simply he's just a provocateur, although he's heavily a provocateur. So my point is, when you're reading poetry or literature especially, you need to go in naked. You need to go in and just read it. Don't say, if you read Jordan Peterson and he says you're an atheist, well, or he says you're not an atheist, and you go, well, I'm an atheist. Who do you know? Right? You need to ask, well, what does he mean by religion? What does he mean by atheist? What is his definition, and how do they interrelate? So you have to go in and try to think about, how does he do it? Because I think as an atheist, on his terminology, it's true. And his terminology, you can transliterate it into objectivist terminology, and he's using things similarly to how Ayn Rand uses them. So we'll talk a little bit more about that if you're interested, but generally, I'll just quickly add that what he means, I think, is, religion, he says, is obsessed with or is concerned with human behavior. So, he differentiates, for instance, Peterson differentiates between scientific truth and religious truth. And this is where it gets very confusing and you have to untangle things, because Ayn Rand and objectivism, and I think normal rational thought tells you, and this is where Peterson is way off on stuff, that there is only one truth. And the reason that Peterson is doing this is because it's a long tradition of Platonic splitting of the is-ought problem and blah, blah, blah. I'm not a philosopher. I don't know how to get into technical details there, but I do know that he's talking about there's truth that comes with the facts of the world, or what is called the is, right? There's the truth about gravity, about evolution, about the biology of your system, about evolutionary biology. You can get into this, about this table, about how this microphone works. There's a truth to that. But that does not imply, in his view, the same truth as ought, like the human behavior realm, how you should act, how you should use the microphone properly to, what is proper action? Should I be spouting racist theories and trying to get people to start the Fourth Reich or whatever, the next Reich? And so there's that element where it's like there's the is ought, and that's just where he gets confused, because Peterson says there's basically a truth for is and there's a truth for the ought realm, or there's a truth for the microphone and the physics behind the microphone, and then there's a truth behind how we should act in relation to what we should say on the microphone. And Ayn Rand said, well, basically there's that's not true. That's not a good assessment of how to get to epistemology. Her whole claim was that you need to go into the world. You need to go into the world naked as a baby and start there. And so when you build things hierarchically, and she was obsessed with hierarchy more than Peterson, and Peterson is like today the arch hierarchy person. So I think that's hilarious, but him and his lobsters, right? He talks about lobsters and hierarchy, and but he's doing it in a very delimited thing, and that's part of his problem is he has not figured out how to bridge that gap. Which, if you read Ayn Rand, and she does it very simply, and she does it because she starts from scratch. When you're a philosopher, you start off at 24 years old or 40 years old or 60 years old, and you do have this whole built-in conceptual framework that you have received from the people that came before you. Well, that's fine. But then what Peterson says is, gotcha, right? He says like, oh, okay. So see, you start with certain basic premises. And Ben Shapiro said this to Sam Harris on a lot of their shows, if you watch any of the shows that they're doing together. And so this is an interesting conception of how they operate together in their viewpoints of truth. And what Peterson is saying is that, gotcha, you can't do that. What Ayn Rand says is, yeah, you can. That's the friggin' job of a philosopher. A philosopher should say, okay, where's step one? Well, I'm 28 years old now, and I have all these preconceived notions. Well, let me go back to the root. And she's, basically one way to think about it is like start as a baby. Well, how does a baby start? Well, they just see existence. That's the first thing, is they're trying to just grapple with existence. And this is why she wrote a whole, her philosophy is called objectivism, because it's pointed and focused on the epistemology, the nature and views on how we know things. That's what's most important to her, not selfishness or capitalism, which come later, in the philosophy. So anyway, that was a long-winded thing. I didn't mean to go that off on the views of philosophy, but I think Peterson has this one view of is-ought, which makes him think that there are two truths, which he has literally said there are two truths. There's a truth for the things like the microphone, and then there's a truth about how you should operate, behaviorally in that. And so when he says you're not an atheist, what he's talking about, I think, is this notion that you have preconceived notions. Now, he believes they're fundamentally built into you, and that's, I think, a different discussion, which is an interesting one. But he thinks of it as like evolutionary biology, and Christianity and religion is basically grasping and understanding the truth of these behavioral norms of how you should act, which is the ought, or how you ought to act. And this is something that religion gives you. And then Ayn Rand says religion does give you that. That's true. And it gives it to you in a prepackaged, non-thinking way. You just accept it dogmatically, and you have to accept it and do it. And then, Peterson says in chapter 4 of his book and in other places that, that is the fundamental, like you can't escape that. He talks about that all the time. You can't escape that you act in a certain context. And Ayn Rand says, you're right. You can't escape in a certain context. And religion is not the way to look at it. It goes even deeper than that. And that's philosophy. Religion is almost like a branch under philosophy. It's like a primitive type of philosophy that just kind of builds a couple very simplistic structures and gives it to you. A proper philosophy should teach you how to guide your conceptual focus to think about all of these things. So philosophy is even broader than religion. And this is where I totally, as much as I love Peterson, and I really, really love the guy, or his ideas, and I don't know him, obviously, but I really enjoy listening to him. But this is one of the things where he really goes off wacky. I think he's totally off on that. Anyway, and this is the guy, coming from me, who's doing a whole grappling series, lecture or whatever on it. So anyway, I read The Westerner, which has this idea of the world began when I was born and the world will end when I die, basically. And that's what Ayn Rand's saying. So I think to understand that, you need to have at least a basic understanding of the conceptual framework that they're working with it. So we're going to go through this poem a little bit step by step to, see what I think is going on in the poem, and kind of have what I call a converse with verse. So let's go through the first stanza. My fathers sleep on the sunrise plains, and each one sleeps alone. Their trails may dim to the grass and rains, for I choose to make my own trail. So, it's like I'm going to carve my own trail. I lay proud claim to their blood and names. That's a critical passage. Everything in great poetry is critical of that. Think about that. I lay proud. So he's saying they live in their own, they sleep on the sunrise plains, and we'll talk about sunrise plains and what that means. But they sleep alone. Their trails may dim, though. It's possible. He says may. It's possible that no one will ever go down their path and do it, because I'm going to do this, because he says, but I lean on no dead kin. My name is mine for the praise or scorn, and the world began when I was born. So sunrise plains and sleep. By the way, I think by sleep, he means dead. Like he means my dead fathers. And if you follow or read anything from Peterson, you know how obsessed he is with what he calls reviving your father, going into the belly of the whale, like Pinocchio, and rescuing your father. And that's fine. I think as we go through this poem, you'll see that is a part of this. But in this stanza, what Clark is saying is that they sleep alone, but they may die, because I'm going to go do my own thing, for I choose to make my own trail. Now he's saying, I lay proud claim to their blood and name. So he's claiming their blood and their name. He claims to come from their stock, but I lean on no dead kin. Sunrise plains. One way to think about that, I think, is kind of like the Elysian fields, or Elysium is how I think of it. And Elysium was the place where the heroes of Greek mythology could go to after they die. You fought and you were a hero, and therefore you could go into the Elysian fields. Now it was a place that you weren't a god, but you were a hero. And this is that's why I love Greek mythology. It's way better than Christian mythology, like 100 times better. It's so much more accurate to how we should, I'm not a psychology expert like Peterson, but I'm just a human. And I think it's way better to approach it in the Greek way than the Christian way, because the Greeks believed that you could strive with the gods. Not that you could emulate them. And I understand that's in Greeks, in Christianity as well. You want to emulate Jesus and all, and that's good. I get that part. But they really stress the hierarchy of striving, in your character. Character is destiny, Aristotle stressed in Eudaimonia. And you really want to go, try to be a hero. And the heroes were humans that looked like gods. And if you listen to any of my other podcasts, you'll know that I stress the fact that Greeks were the first one to create gods in their own image. Everyone around them in the Mediterranean and in the whole entire universe of mankind had always made gods in the images of monsters, animals, mountains, whatever, but not in the image of themselves. So anyway, you have this godlike creature of of men, and they have a hierarchy that they can go into. You be a normal person, you can be a slob, you can be a normal person, you can rise up and be a hero, and then there were the sons of gods, and then there were the gods themselves, and then the gods had a hierarchy where they had to kill their father. Anyway, kill their father, like Zeus kills Kronos to save all of his brothers and bring in a new order. So there's a hierarchy that models itself after our own hierarchy, and the gods, we are truly from the stock of gods as much as created from them. So my father sleep on the sunrise plains, Clark is talking about Elysian fields, I think, that my father, the predecessor who came before me, the men who built America, the men who built the railroads, the men who built those towns over there are great men, and they deserve to go stride with the gods because they did great things. Now they sleep alone because they built, like, as we were seeing in the Westerner, they have the spirits of a Westerner. To build something unique, you have to have the spirit of the Westerner, and my fathers had that. Now, their trails, the physical world that they entered into and built in their own image, may dim, because I'm going to do it my own way. And I lay proud claim to their blood and name, but I lean on no dead kin. My name is mine for the praise or scorn, and the world began when I was born. So we're getting this idea of he can appreciate, he can revivify spiritually, possibly, the idea of his fathers and what they did, but he's going to do it his own way. He's going to do whatever he wants. Not just whatever he wants, but he's going to build his own world for praise or scorn. Whether people like him or hate him, it's going to be his. So you're starting to see, I think, why the arch individualist Ayn Rand might like this poem, because it's about building your own values. So let's go into this as we talk about the idea of building your own values. So this is a paradox. I wrote this down as I was reading it. In stanza 1, by the way, before we continue, is how does an individualist follow his predecessors? And I think this poem expresses it. As I lay proud, the way an individualist does it is he doesn't have to literally do what they did, which I think is how most people think of honoring your fathers, is do what they tell you. Do what your fathers say. Obey thy parents, right? That's a commandment. This is a totally different way of thinking about it, is I'm going to choose to be in a tradition of individualism. That's how I'm going to honor my fathers. And if that means that the things that they created die, then that means that the things that they created die. That's what that means. And so in The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, and let me take Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, John Galt is purposefully described as his childhood. Very briefly, she's not obsessed with childhood as a lot of modern psychologists are. But John Galt is purposefully the son of a gas station agent, I think, if I remember correctly, or something like that. Like he's the son of or maybe it's Howard Roark. I might be mixing them up. But the point is that her grand ideal heroes are not the sons of gods. They strive to become gods, and that's what makes them gods. Is Howard Roark does not say in the beginning of The Fountainhead that he hates all architects that came before him. He's going to do whatever the hell he wants, but he does criticize the people who came before him. And what he says is that you shouldn't just do what other people did because that's what you're supposed to do. You should think about it, and you should try to, build your own type of structure and values to the best you can while learning from them. Okay, the next stanza. They, my fathers, the heroes that slept on the Elysium fields or the sunrise plain, which is another form of heaven. You can think of it as a Greek pagan mythological view of heaven as the sunrise plains. So they built high towns on their old log sills, where the great slow rivers gleamed, but with new live rock from the savage hills, I'll build as they only dreamed. So I wanted to tell you a little story about a guy I really like, David O. Selznick. Now, David O. Selznick, if you're not aware, is the producer of one of the greatest movies ever made. And I'm not just saying that. I mean, it's won a lot of Academy Awards. It has been, I think until recently, adjusted for inflation, the most profitable movie in theaters ever made. I mean, they didn't have DVDs and all the stuff we have today, of course. They just had, the theater. So if you take just ticket sales, it's, I think, number one still, but maybe Star Wars or Avatar or something has beat it, even adjusted for inflation. So the story is of David O. Selznick starting his own studio. Now, one of the interesting things about this is this Gone with the Wind is the movie, by the way. I don't think I mentioned that. Gone with the Wind, to still consider one of the greatest movies of all time. And in making this immense epic of a movie in 1939, by the way, it took 5 directors to make this. It took a whole bevy of writers. The creation, so David O. Selznick created a whole department within film. He was the first one to create production design. So today that's a whole career set you can do. And he created that. He's the first one to do that. And he was the first one to institute the drawing of every scene ahead of time. So there was such a thing as storyboarding, which is what it's called, where you draw out, like, here's what this scene's going to look like. Here's what the next scene's going to look like. But Selznick was the first one to make that like part of the whole process, that you had to do that ahead of time. And so for this film, he did that ahead of time. Now, what's interesting about David O. Selznick that I think is related to this poem is that he was born into basically what would be thought of as Hollywood aristocracy. He was the son of a very successful film producer, and he married the daughter of Louis B. Mayer, who was the head of MGM Studios, which was the most powerful film studio in Hollywood. And Louis B. Mayer was at the time the most powerful man in Hollywood. So Selznick could do anything. I mean, he learned how to make films at the early eras of film alongside the men who built the film industry. Right there, these are the guys who made the golden era of Hollywood possible, which I think David O. Selznick is part of the golden era. And here's an interesting quote. So Louis B. Mayer, of course, has offered his very successful, very qualified son-in-law. So it wasn't pure nepotism, of course, although I'm sure nepotism had something to do with it. But Louis B. Mayer offered Selznick a lucrative job, and Selznick responded in a letter, "Under no circumstances would it be right for me to go with MGM. Under no circumstances." Now, he did not despise Louis B. Mayer. In fact, he very much loved his father-in-law. And he used to call him dad all the time, and not just as ironic or any kind of thing you would see with film people today, where they're talking about their father-in-laws ironically, and they're like, "Thanks, dad," right, to their asshole father-in-law. Selznick had a good 3 reasons that he wrote down to his father-in-law in a letter of why he could not take this on. Let me read these. First, he said that he could not face being related to someone he worked for. That was the first reason he had to refuse this job. "I would never know whether I had gotten ahead on my own or through the help of someone. I'm not alone willing, but believe me, anxious to take the rap whenever I am wrong. It helps me grow." The second reason, though he would use the knowledge he had learned from his predecessors, he wanted to build something from scratch. So the second reason is he wanted to build something from scratch, even though he learned from it. Lastly, the last reason was he was the type who wanted to pave new roads. And I think this is the most relevant, rather than tread on old worn ones. So here's what he says, quote, I suppose it is something akin to the fellows who would rather plan and dig roads through mountains than drive over boulevards in a Lincoln. So David O. Selznick was respected, and he respected those who came before him, but he desired nothing more than to build his own dreams. And by doing so, he created the most popular films of all time by becoming independent and doing it his own way while laying proud claim to those who came before him. He created so many great films, including King Kong, Rebecca, and Gone with the Wind. So, knowing that this is one of the wise things that you can learn from him. Excuse me. One of the wise things you can learn from him is that if you want to build as they only dreamed, it takes a lot of strength to do that. Immense strength of character. And that kind of strength has to be built. It can't be given to you. You have to forge it through hell, in a sense. And he willingly chose to go through the hardest path possible. And when you read, there's an interesting book called The Memos of David O. Selznick, that, because there's this huge archive. He was not a huge talker, as far as I understand. They didn't have voice memos. I think they did have a little bit of that, but he wrote a lot, and he wrote down his memos, or he got them out on paper. And so you can see his thought process a lot through this. And he purposely wanted to be punched in the face as hard as possible over and over and over again. And, there's a reason for that. And I think it's, I think it's so that he could build a stronger character. So let's go back into the poem. Build as they only dream, right? So, okay, they built high towns on their old log sills. So one way to think about this is his fathers lived in a wood age. We'll talk about ages in a second, but his fathers lived in the age of wood and built their own world out of wood heroically. So again, he's proud of them. But he will build from new live rock, from the savage hills, and he'll build as they only dream. Now, what I think he's saying is that the smoke scarce dies where the trail camp lies, till the rails glint down the pass. The desert springs into fruit and wheat, and I lay the stones of a solid street over yesterday's untrod grass. Now, I think what he's saying is that his heroes, his predecessors, their camp is just over yonder. So he's not going on another planet, right? He's not going somewhere. He's still in the same existence world, but and they're within sight of it to a degree, and he could see their smoke, their world. But nevertheless, he's creating his own world over here, and he'll do things that they only dreamed of. A word on the ages of man. I think he's referring to that when he says they built high towns on their old log sills where the great slow rivers gleamed, but with new live rock from the savage hills all built as they only read. So you think about he's stressing old log sills. So it's like they're in the wooded age, and he's going to be in the rock age. And there was there was a lot of different ages stressed. For instance, in Hesiod's 5 ages, there was the golden age, the silver age, the bronze age, the heroic age, and the iron age. In Ovid, there was the golden, silver, iron, and bronze as well. He just doesn't have the heroic. He just puts it in terms of that. And Christian has 6 ages of the world. Also, sometimes people say 7 ages of the world. Hindu has Yuga. Mesoamerican has the 5 suns. So basically J.R.R. Tolkien has 4 ages in his fiction book because it's so prevalent. So the point is that this is a common view of things, is this idea of multiple ages. And Peterson stresses this all the time when he talks about, what's going on in the flood myth, for instance. And what happens is one age of man makes some kind of mistake, and then they do something really bad. And so the gods flood them out. And this is a common theme. And then you have to start over with a new age. Well, I think to some degree, that's what Badger Clark is talking about here. He's saying they built high towns on their old log sills where the great slow rivers gleamed. And this is, he is saying that, again, he's using language that's natural. That's part of the nature of the world that we live in, and he's not denigrating them. They did great things, but I'm going to do greater things, or not even greater things. I'm going to do the things that they could only dream of. Now, maybe you could say it's because they built on log sills that he's able to build on with rock, and I think that's true. And I don't think that he is not acknowledging that. I think he is acknowledging that, but he's showing how you pave an independent world. This poem is great because it shows you how to pave an independent world, even though we live in a world that's been paved over and over and over again. And part of it is because the world began when I was born, and the world is mine to win. So he's building with rock, they build with wood. And Rourke says that Howard Rourke in the Fountainhead says the same thing. Never build one type of building with the same materials that you built with another. So if you have new materials, you should be able to build new things. So you couldn't build with marble a skyscraper. That wouldn't work, but you can with the metal that you can do. And he was obsessed with figuring out in the book, he's obsessed with figuring out how to manipulate the world in better ways for his own purposes. Okay. So, till the rails glint down the pass, the desert springs into fruit and wheat. And so he's saying kind of like, even in this new desert land where I'm going into, where there isn't anybody, I'm going to mark off my own territory. Remember, this poem is called The Westerner. I'm going to mark off my own territory, and there will be fruit and wheat, coming from my own area. And I'll lay stones for a solid street over yesterday's untrod grass. Again, no one's going to be here. It's going to be me, just me. And this is all within the framework that he's acknowledging his fathers are there, but he's going to build his own world from scratch. So it sounds like a paradox, but the definition of a paradox is something that seems like a contradiction, but on first glance, but is not when you dig into it a little bit deeper. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It seems like it's a contradiction, but it's not, because when you think about the times and the complexity of what it means to be a whole era, you can see why it could be the best of times and the worst of times. You could have both. I think today we live in, the best of times and the worst. I think everybody thinks that about their age. I'm sure a lot of people do. Okay, the next stanza. We're going to be talking about new values in this stanza. I waste no new spiritual values, I think. I waste no thought on my neighbor's birth or the way he makes his prayer. I grant him a white man's room on earth if his game is only square. While he plays it straight, I'll call him mate. If he cheats, I drop him flat. Old class and rank are a worn-out lie, for all clean men are as good as I, and a king is only that. Okay, so this is a controversial stanza, to say the least. But one thing is, in this new world of mine, he's saying, I think, I don't care where my neighbors are from. So it's possible that his fathers cared where his neighbors came from, not him. In his new world, he doesn't care. He doesn't care where his neighbors are from or the color of their skin. And now here's where it gets controversial and a little bit paradoxical, maybe even contradictory, maybe even a little bit racist. Maybe he is racist a little bit. I am white, and if this neighbor, whatever he comes from, whatever skin color he is, plays my game properly, then he may enter into my world. Now, here's the thing. The next thing he says is duplicity will be treated with violence. So, and then the last thing he says, in my world, there is no old class and rank. Here you start where you stand, and that goes for kings. Peterson discusses a lot the idea from Nietzsche, whatever, that God is dead. And Peterson explains that what Nietzsche meant was that the dogmatic elements that we used to believe in God is now gone. And so we have two options, and one of them is to create our own values, which Peterson says is wrong and impossible because our values are ingested or built into us in a way that is inescapable, which again is something that Ayn Rand said as well, but she discussed it differently and I think helped bring clarity to what is meant by inherent. So there are certain inherent things that we have, in how our consciousness works, and this is what Peterson is referring to. But anyway, Peterson is saying that, okay, God is dead. With religion came a lot of dogmatic things, that you had to act a certain way, that proper behavior, meant maybe, and it could be hijacked. So it could be taken, well, I'm going to kill the infidels. And that was, you get that with Christianity. You get that with any type of religion. He doesn't say Christian God is dead, although I think Nietzsche is referring to that. He's saying God is dead, and especially in Europe. And the idea was, well, hey, we no longer have a system of beliefs which unites all of us. And by the way, Peterson points out that you have a stressing of, you have Nietzsche stressing after this that because God is dead and because there's no religious unifying force that keeps us all in line, we're going to lose hundreds of millions of people in death and horrible things, which of course in the 20th century occurred under Nazism and communism. Or you could think of just a different form of nationalism, because they were trying to, one way to think about them, in this era, is they were trying to build their own value structures instead of religious ones. And all they did was replace it with national ones. And that was, or with white supremacy. But it was really, the Third Reich was a new form of religion. And that's true. I think that's very, very accurate from what I understand of that era. Now, my point is that, what Peterson is mentioning is that it's impossible to build your own values because the religious values that he's talking about basically informs the substrata of our entire existence and our entire consciousness. Now, so what are we talking about with, did we get off track? And I don't think so, because I waste no thought on my neighbor's birth or the way he makes his prayer. So this whole stanza, I think, is talking about how to build your own new values in the Nietzschean sense, in the way that Peterson is saying, or claiming to say. And Peterson does kind of acknowledge this in this passage where he talks about you're not an atheist. So I'll actually read that. I think it's interesting and relevant. So first off, he says that religion is instead, Peterson says religion is instead about proper behavior. It's not about scientific truth. So remember what I said earlier about that. It's about what Plato called the good. A genuine religious acolyte isn't trying to formulate accurate ideas about the objective nature of the world, although he may be trying to do that too. He's striving instead to be a good person, right? So whether that means obedient, but whatever, that's what he's focused on. It's therefore necessary and desirable to have a dogmatic element. What good is a value system that does not provide a stable structure? What good is a value system that does not point to something higher? And so that's what, the claim is, that you do need that kind of structure. Okay, I can get that. Does that mean that what we see in our religious belief, does that mean that what we see is dependent on our religious beliefs? So when we see the world, is it inherently religious? And he's saying yes. And again, this is in a chapter where he talks about the tools we use to see the world. And then he talks about how values are hierarchical in a sense, because, and he puts so much stress on this, because we don't have an option to have values. We don't have an option to value one thing over another. Everything we do is a choice, and some things we choose more to value more than other things. So we can say, I want to be doing this podcast rather than going out and hanging out with my friends, having a mimosa, right? That would be a nice, pleasant thing to do, is have a good conversation. Instead, I woke up early and I tried to put this whole structure together, and, on a poem that I've taught to 5th grade or 8th graders, because I think it's a great poem and I've thought about it a lot and I want to know more about it. And I think it's relevant to Sunday morning poetry, blah, blah, blah. So I have this whole hierarchical structure that this is more relevant or more important to me, value hierarchically than something else I could be doing. And Peterson is saying that that's built into the stratus of our being, that we cannot escape it. Well, Ayn Rand also says you can't escape this kind of conceptual awareness. And, so without going too far into the theories that Ayn Rand has and what I think Peterson is saying, the point I'm trying to make is they're saying very similar things, but Ayn Rand is saying it better and more clearly. And that's why it's better, because it's clearer. And so, excuse me, you have to read more of Ayn Rand if you're interested in this. If this is something you're interested in, read Opar, The Objective. This is a book by Peikoff, who was Ayn Rand's intellectual heir. Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. You need to read that if you're interested at all, especially the first several chapters. Really need to read the whole thing because it's all integrated. As Hegel puts it, the true is the whole. And so you need to understand the whole thing if you really want to understand this philosophy. And it's completely different than a lot that you might understand, but it's similar to what Peterson is saying. And this is where I think it's so great, is what he's trying to do is he's on his way. He's on the road to objectivism. He's just been detoured his whole life by a Christian philosophy. And he's trying to be as reality oriented as he can. And I think that's where I really admire him, is he not just trying, he is as reality oriented. He just doesn't have the proper guidance that I think a good philosophy would give to him. And so when he says, does that mean that what we see is dependent on our religious beliefs? Again, he means religious beliefs in the same way that Ayn Rand would say that when you look at existence, your consciousness has a nature. And so that nature means that you're seeing the world in a particular way. And one of parts of that nature is what she called perception, and then volition, and then conceptual. So you have all of those. Now, Peterson doesn't parse those out, which is part of the problem that you have here. But anyway, when he says, yes, it is dependent on your religious beliefs. Yes, it is dependent on the nature of your consciousness. I'm transliterating here. And what we don't see as well. So, remember, we can't see all of existence all at once. We can only see one thing at a time. That's how value hierarchies work, is, there's an infinite amount of existence, ENTS, like things. You can learn about animal physiology. You can learn about the psychology of how gay men interact with females after doing acid. You can study neurology. You could study, depression. You could study the stars. You could study how to make a desk. I mean, there's an infinite amount of things you could study, but you can't do it all at once because you're limited. So you can only do one thing at a time, which is why hierarchy is so important, because you have to choose which one to do first. Okay, so it's this whole substrata of how we see the world determines is religious or based on our inherent the nature of our inherent conceptual faculty or consciousness, and what we don't see, because again, it's hierarchical. So we choose this, not that. Okay. You might object, but I'm an atheist. This is Peterson. No, you're not, Peterson tells you. And if you want to understand this, you could read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, perhaps the greatest novel ever written. But I don't know about that, but it's a great novel in which the main character, Raskolnikov, decides to take his atheism with true seriousness, commits what he has rationalized as benevolent murder, and pays the price. Oh, man. So much to say there. I might have to do a podcast just on this because I've read Dostoevsky a good amount. Like a lot of classic literature, I don't know that I grasp it fully. It will take a lot of years to really grasp it because it's so important. I think that's true of all great literature, Rand included. So, just a sidetrack here. Raskolnikov did take his atheism seriously in a particular context, which was a religious neo-mystical context. So he's in Russia. This isn't Rand's atheism. This isn't an atheism of completely structuring the world properly. So Peterson is correct that, this is what people always equated atheism with was Russia, was communist Russia. Like that's the equation, is you either have religion or you have Russia, communist Russia. Like that's the dichotomy. It's like, no, there's another form of atheism that is focused on reality all the time. Whereas this is basically just another form, the Dostoevskian, Raskolnikovian, I should say, the Raskolnikovian atheism, this character in Crime and Punishment, is a neo-mystic. He's just taking it as whim, his own emotions, versus, because that's what he wants to do, is he thinks that he's this great man, but he's not there yet. And just like Napoleon needed to, sometimes do bad things to get to where he needs to go, so Raskolnikov needs to do bad things because he needs money, because he's a great man. Obviously he needs it. And, so what Peterson is accusing atheists of here, and he said, if you think you're an atheist, you're not, because you wouldn't, if you took atheism seriously, you would do what Raskolnikov did, which is murder people. And that's like such a, I would expect more from Peterson. And where I think he goes wrong is that he is saying in his own way, or he's confused because there's some depth to Raskolnikov's character, obviously, and he's interested in the psychology. So he's, Peterson's been trapped in this little world, and he's not able to escape the system of thought that he's been in, or, from his readings. And that's very difficult to do. But that's what philosophy should be teaching, is how to do that, how to escape your system to assess it. But anyway, in Crime and Punishment, I want to address this theory, and maybe I'll do a whole video on this, but it's because it's really interesting. Is Raskolnikov does take his atheism seriously in the context of what it means to be a mystical atheist in Russia, which is a very mystical place. So he does take that seriously, and he takes it as whim that he is, without evidence, he's this great man, which again is not what it means to be an atheist, but whatever. Now you have, okay, I take this seriously, I'm a great man. Where does he come up with that? No, blank out. There's no evidence that he has any reason for that. So therefore, I need money, and therefore the only way I could do it is to kill this person. Of course, there's other ways to make money, and we all know there are other ways to make money, but he has rationalized in his mind this particular mode of thought and this particular mode of behavior. And so because he's not straddled by the fear of death, life after death, of an avenging God, he doesn't believe that, he has thrown that out, well, therefore he can get away with this. So what happens to Raskolnikov is he becomes completely sick to his soul. He sees things all over the place. He sees like the dead woman walking, like how is she still alive? Like he sees blood everywhere. It's like out damn spot. Like the psychological so the real issue is that psychologically he goes through hell. And that's the punishment. The punishment is not just that he goes to prison, because at the very end, spoiler alert, he does go to prison because he turns himself in. But the reason is because he's gone through so much hell, he just wants a relief, and he wants to get over it. And because he's always evading, he's always getting away from it. Well, that's proof that atheism is right. That you don't need a God, like a supernatural God, telling you what to do to believe that in fact, it's based on a rational view of our own psychology and the way that this earth works, which is not the same thing when people talk about a supernatural God above that says not to do it. If you want to take God as metaphorical for that force in our mind, great. That's the role of stories. But it's not the same thing of what religionists mean, Peterson. Sorry. So, Raskolnikov is miserable the moment he does this act. And reality is the reason, because he's confronted with reality and he hates what he's done. And not only, does he hate it, but, it's not even just hating it. It's just that he's absolutely miserable. And we know this in real life. Like Bernie Madoff says that he was relieved when he was arrested. Well, why? Because he was lying to everybody, and he was seeing, like, he couldn't slip up a little bit. That's hell. Like if you have to consciously watch everything you say, you're not able to just kind of freely float around and enjoy the world that you live in because you're freaked the hell out that you're going to say the wrong thing accidentally, or that maybe you're going to talk to somebody who's related to somebody who knows somebody who can catch you off on something you said. And one of the most fascinating passages in Crime and Punishment is when Raskolnikov is talking to the police detective, the guy investigating this murder. It's like the guy who's investigating the murder clearly knows that Raskolnikov is suspect number one, and he knows that he's doing it. And there's like this brilliant, I mean, this is why this is a great novel. There's this brilliant cat and mouse discussion. So it's not even just cat and mouse, like, you know, the burglar's climbing up escape routes and he's getting away and, ooh, I can't catch him. And, you know, I try to lay a trap, but he gets away physically. It's an intellectual cat and mouse game. You know, the detective will pull out a piece of evidence and see how Raskolnikov acts. He'll read a journal entry from Raskolnikov and see how he believes in this. The detective will try to act as though he agrees with his philosophy of the great man theory of history and how you need to do certain things to see if he can catch Raskolnikov. So, you know, Raskolnikov is playing like a quadruple world view where he's like, okay, I need to tell this person what he thinks I know, which I actually do believe, but I have to do it in a way that I don't believe it so that you can see it, you know, so that I can make sure that I, you know, don't go to jail. So that was a huge tangent on building your own values and Nietzschean philosophy of God is dead and that you then have to build your own values. But you can build your own values. That is what I think this poem is saying. This poem is saying you can build, and by values, I don't just mean material. This poem is such a great poem because it's both. I waste no thought on my neighbor's birth or the way he makes his prayer. So in his world, maybe his fathers did waste thought on their neighbor's birth. That was one problem they had. Maybe that was one mistake they made. Well, whether they made that mistake or not, I don't care, because in my world, the world begins when I was born. So I'm going to make not only my own physical world, I'm going to build my own house, I'm going to build my own city and world, literally build it physically, but I'm also going to build my own spiritual values. I'm not going to waste my thought on my neighbor's birth. I don't care what color skin you are. I don't care if you pray 5 times a day to Mecca. I don't care, you know, if you do anything to you know, immolate your own body, you destroy your genitals to pray to whatever God you think. As long as you're not hurting other people, and we'll get to that in a second, then you're welcome to hang out with me. I'll spend time with you. I'll look you straight in the eye and respect you, whatever color your skin, whatever your beliefs are. Now this is where it gets a little weird. I grant him a white man's room on earth if his game is only square. Now you can presume that the writer is white. So he's acknowledging, I think one way to take this is he's acknowledging the differences in physical looks while saying that that's not really relevant, that I'll grant you equal stay with me in this room on earth if you play the game properly. Now, Peterson talks a lot about playing games and how, you know, we all play games, and that's to some degree what he means by religious structure, is that, you know, when we're in society, if we, let's say, go to a talk, a lecture by Peterson, well, one of the games that you're playing is that you're going to sit quietly and listen to the lecturer on stage, that you're not going to shout or yell or run around and scream or take your clothes off or start kissing the person in front of you or pee in the corner, right? Like, you're not going to do a whole bunch of stuff like anything. Now you may think, well, that's so ridiculous you're coming up with that stuff. Well, theater in France in the 1700s, and basically for most of its history in the theater of France, was a raucous thing. It was not like it is today. And you had to, as the people on stage, had to fight to get the attention of the audience and to try to quiet them down. But it was common for them to interact with the playwrights, which with the players on stage, which is a very weird thing for us to think about. For us, the taboo is to make noise. Like if you've ever been to a live theater, like it's like, people are talking, and then the lights go, and then there's a hush, and you're supposed to go. And there's even a taboo of when to clap. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but you feel like a moron. I've done this before. Like you go to a musical or a symphony, and you think that a song is over, so you start clapping, and then you're like, oh, shit, no one's clapping, because you're the idiot who didn't realize that was just one theme of the broader song. You're supposed to wait for the whole song to be over. And a lot of times you get confused with that because it seems like they go from song to song, composition to composition, and it's like, well, then there's these themes within it, and then they stop and they come back up, and you're like, oh shit, and then you screwed up. So unless you know the song really well, wait for someone else to do it. That is a behavior. That is one behavior. You are behaving a certain particular way, whether you want to realize that, whether you realize it or not. And you have to understand that that's what he's talking about here by games. So that's what he means by games. You're playing a particular game. I am quiet while waiting for other people to tell me when it is proper to clap. That's the game you're playing. So I grant him a white man's room on earth if his game is only square, is a particular way of saying that I'm playing this game. This is my game. Yeah, and yes, I am a white man. And I don't think he's necessarily being racist, although he might be. But I'm playing this game. I'm a white man. If you want to play with me, great. If not, don't play with me. Go over there. Play your own damn game. Leave me alone. And then he says, I'll while he plays it straight, I'll call him mate. If he cheats, I drop him flat. Again, this is in the context of I waste no thought of my neighbor's birth. So I don't care where you're from, just like you don't care where I'm from. Like, think of David O. Selznick. He was born into wealth, into the aristocracy of Hollywood, but he doesn't care where you're from. He wants you to, if you're going to be on his set, work on his movie, do things the way that then you have to do it the way he wants. If you don't want to, then don't be on his movie set. Go over there. That's it. If you're black and you don't want to work with him because he's white, well, he is white, so don't hang out with him. That's fine. While he plays it straight, I'll call him mate. If he cheats, I drop him flat. Old class and rank are a worn out lie, for all clean men are as good as I, and a king is only that. So there's three things here you can take. Class is a worn out lie. Class and rank are a worn out lie. So in other words, David O. Selznick was an aristocrat. Well, he's not an aristocrat. He's just David O. Selznick. And he's an aristocrat today in 2018 because he worked from scratch and he wanted to get hit in the face as much as possible. Not because he was the son of a famous, not a famous, but a pretty successful producer and the son-in-law of Louis B. Mayer, who basically was, made the golden era of film. Like, he was one of the most critical figures of that era. Old class and rank. So where you come from, old money is relevant, which is a European idea that you have to come from old money or old stock or you're irrelevant. For all clean men are as good as I, and a king is only that. So we'll talk about the clean men thing in a second, but king is only that. That means that a king, I think that means that a king is only that, and either he's a clean man or he's not. That's what I think he means, is that he's just another man like me. He may be a king in his own right, and that's great. He can come and I'll grant him a room on earth if his game is only square. Great. But if not, goodbye. Now, I do think there might be a relation between clean men are as good as I and white man's room on earth. He may not be referring in this case. I think this is a clue. This is why context is so important. You have to think about the whole thing, is that by white man's room on earth, he may be racist. And by racist, I don't mean the way that we think of it today, where it's like white men hate black people or something like that. Like black people are beneath them, they're Neanderthals or something. No. By racist, I mean even the quote unquote positive view of races. So if you're black and you think that, there were black successful people that came before me, therefore I am good, or that, black people are good because the people who came before me are good. Even if you're saying that other races are good because their predecessors are good, you're racist because you're relying on the color of your skin rather than the content of your individual character. So if a white man says, I'm great because all the great men who built things in Europe for thousands of years, and that's the civilization we now are relying on, that gave us science and religion or fiction and, whatever, flying to the moon, it was all white men who did all that stuff. Therefore, white men are great and I'm great. That's racist because you didn't do shit. Just because you have the same color skin as someone doesn't matter. It's racist if you think about that. Now, another way he might have thought about this or said this, and the clean men are as good as I think might be a clue, possibly. He might mean it in an ancient type of thinking, like pre-religion, pre-history, like ancient. If you think about why black is bad in moral terms and white is good in moral terms, this could go down into evolutionary biology. I mean, a light room or a light cave is better than a dark one, because if you go into a dark cave, you'll get your head bitten off by a bear, possibly. And so light is a very important tool to our cognitive abilities because we cannot see in the dark. So it's a scary proposition. And think about men and women who didn't have fire. Now, I don't know when fire came, but I imagine that having fire literally changed our neurology. I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not a neurologist, so maybe I'm full of shit. But I imagine it also changed our fovea, the way that our eyes work, because our eyes are constantly maximizing for light. And obviously, like, you can see in the moonlight a little bit, but not like a cat can see, right? Like a cat can see a lot clearer in the night. It can see a little bit better with just a minimal of light. And bats can see in pitch dark because they use they can't see with their eyes, but they use sonic things, and just like creatures down in the deep dark ocean can do similar types of things sometimes, right? I don't know how, I'm not versed in animal biology, but my point is that we have like these eyes that are constantly maximizing for selecting the right one thing to focus on, and having everything peripherally not be able to see it. And this is a very complex thing that we have built within us, which is what Peterson talks about as why, we have this hierarchy, because we look at one thing and not another. And just FYI, he tells, if you want to do something, go Google Daniel Simon's The Gorilla Test and take it. It's a YouTube video. It's like 60 seconds. Just do it. And try to do it to the best of your ability. You'll see what I mean by this focus thing. But anyway, like you're focusing, and I wouldn't be surprised if there was some evidence that we probably had fire for hundreds of thousands of years in some level, and that, or maybe millions, and that has shaped the way that we see the world. Because again, if you go into a dark cave, it's bad, because you could get your head bitten off by a bear or some other monster, a mastodon. And if you could bring a flame and bring light to it, then that light can bring good. And so often white is equivalent to light, or equated with light. So my point is that this is one of the reasons why you get this dichotomy between white and black, or light and dark. Light equals good, black equals dark. And this is one thing that's black equals dark, black equals evil, and not black as in Africans. I mean, although it's been related that way, unfortunately, but black because, again, it's the lack of light. So it's a lacking of sight, which means you could die. Bad things can happen to you. So I think that may be the sense he's talking about with clean men and white men's room on earth, is you have this ancient view of seeing white and black as, black is bad, moral. And, like we even put it that way, like in more morality, there's no such thing as white and black. It's all gray. Like that's what people say. Like, you're forgetting about the gray, which is a mixture of white and black. So I think that's what he means. Now it gets confused because you may think, well, then are all white men good and all black men are bad? He may be inferring that in a way that I would definitely disagree with. But I don't know that that's true because the context is that he doesn't care where your birth is. He doesn't care about any of that stuff. This is a new world. But in this new world, maybe he's pulling on ancient pagan philosophy of, and it's really psychology, because even today, you're scared of a darkened room. You don't want to go into a darkened house. Like, that's a scary proposition. You could die. Okay. I dream no dreams of a nursemaid state that will spoon me out my feed. A food. A stout heart sings in the fray with fate, and the shock and sweat are good. From noon to noon, all the earthly boon that I ask my God to spare is a little daily bread and store, with the room to fight the strong for more, and the weak shall get their share. So, okay. So one, simply, I dream no dream of a nursemaid states is he doesn't want handouts. And that, so that I agree with. Stout heart is one where I think it's kind of like this idea of whistle while you work, even while you're fighting. You're fighting, you're whistling, you're happy. This is a good thing to do. There's this quote from, you can see this in the movie 300, but it's from, not Thucydides. The first, maybe it is, no, Thucydides did Peloponnesian. Who did the? Herodotus. From Herodotus, there's this quote where he's talking about Persians coming to the Greeks and they confront the Spartans. And one of the Persians says, and you can see this again you can Google this and see it on YouTube. He says, our arrows will blot out the sun. And I think it's Dionychus or one of the Spartans says, then we will fight in the shade. And that is a stout heart. A stout heart, stout basically means, in this context, brave and determined. And so when he's saying a stout heart sings in the fray with fate and the shock and sweat are good, he's talking about this, that there's a fighting element, that is what you should be focused on and what is good. Now, from noon to noon, all the earthly boon. Noon to noon is basically just another way of saying 24/7, 365. And then he says, room to fight the strong for more. Now, I don't take in this context that he is talking about being highly, that he's talking about physical violence specifically. I think he's talking about competitiveness and being competitive and fighting, and that there are hierarchies within human context. So there are, within human societies, there are hierarchies, and some will fight to get to the top of the hierarchy, which we'll talk about in a second. So strength in this context may have more to do with competence or ability to work the land better than others. So let's look at this whole poem for a second. This is not the last. This is not the last stanza. Just give a context of where we are. So my father sleep so we're talking about past here, right? We're talking about my father sleep on the sunrise plains, and each one sleeps alone. The trails may dim. So he's talking about the past, the people who came before me. He's talking about, in a sense, metaphysics, the starting point of reality. This is the reality that I'm born into. I have no choice to be born into this. I'm not going to hate on them. This is the world that I'm born into. Metaphysically, this is it. I accept that. I came into this world that way. And I accept that they built these lands. Like, this is something that I'm going to learn from. I'm going to take, but I'm going to do my own thing. And then he's talking about, and I'm going to build my own moralistic religion, if you want to put it in Petersonian terms, or, proper behavior. This is the proper behaviors. I'm not going to waste thought on my neighbor's birth. If they're clean, if they're good, if they try for moral proper behavior on my terms, my game, then he's square. We're good. A-okay with me. If he plays it straight, I'll call him mate. If he cheats, I'll drop him flat. And then I don't care about old class and rank. I don't care about kings. If you're a good man, then you're a good man. Now he's talking about government. I dream no dreams of a nursemaid state. That's where we are now. Not talking about government. I mean, we're talking about government. I don't need in my government. I'm going to build a city. There's going to be a hospital. There's going to be a church. If you want, or a place to worship whatever it is that you want to worship, or think whatever it is you want to think. And there's going to be firehouses and police stations. I'm going to build buildings bigger than anybody else's, banks and industry and all that stuff. And I don't want a nursemaid state in my government that will spoon me out my feet, because I'll just get lazy. If you spoon me my food, I'm going to be too lazy to pick up the goddamn spoon for myself. A stout heart sings in the fray with fate. I want to have the arrows blotting out the sun, so that I can, fight in the shade. That's what it means to be stout. And from noon to noon, all the earthly all I ask is that with my work, I'll get a little bit of food, and a little bit of daily bread that I can work to have a little bit extra for later in case I get sick. With the room to fight the strong for more, and by strong, and have the capacity after I do my work, that I'm so competent. This is the kind of strength Peterson talks about, is not a strength of I'm a man, you're a woman, therefore I'm going to punch you in the face and be your master. It's more like I'm really good with computers, so I'm going to build a software engineering or software company and become the best software company on the planet. I'm going to be Facebook, so I'm going to be at the top of the hierarchy in terms of the way people act. And they do. When people at Facebook act, or people within Silicon Valley, they act a certain way around Zuckerberg because he's the top of the hierarchy. And the weak shall get their share for more. So even if you're the custodian at Facebook, you still get a lot of money. You're still making a lot of money. Facebook made, of the first custodians at Facebook before they went public and they had shares of Facebook, he made millionaires of them. Not trillionaires or billionaires, but millionaires. They made a lot of money. And they still make a lot of money to this day. Even if they're only making $30,000, $40,000 a year, the weak shall get, they're not as competent. So they don't get to, if you can't, only Zuckerberg and a few people could build the company. Some people could build the tech. Only Zuckerberg could build the company. So he's at the top of that hierarchy. Okay, last stanza. We're almost there. Thank you for bearing with me. The sunrise plains are a tender haze. So remember, sunrise plains, we talked about earlier, Elysian fields, right? The sunrise plains are a tender haze, and the sunset seas are gray. But I stand here where the bright skies blaze over me and the big today. What good to me is a vague maybe, or a mournful might have been. For the sun wheels swift from morn to morn, and the world began when I was born, and the world is mine to win. So this is why this is great poetry. So this first line, the sunrise plains are a tender haze. That is the first line, not the first line. It's in the first line. My fathers sleep on the sunrise plains. So that's where his fathers come from. So part of what makes great poetry is that you get that structure, and the sound also lend itself to the meaning. So if you were to take this by itself, it wouldn't have as much meaning as if you take it with the first line of my fathers sleep on the sunrise plains, and each one sleeps alone. And then if you take it within the context of this first stanza, and then if you take that within the context of the entire poem. So one mistake that a lot of even very smart and well-versed poetic critics, and professors do, is they tend to do too much of taking the psychology of the writer, the philosophical views of the writer. That doesn't matter. We're only looking at the poem. Now, that may help you lend itself, but a good poem should stand on its own. That's important. So the sunrise plains are a tender haze. So this is, again, great poetry, because take the word tender haze, just haze. He could be playing on the idea of obscuring his view. So haze, could be like the haze of the clouds coming down, and you can't really see into the mountains over there, because there's a haze of clouds covering that mountain. And if you've ever gone to Northern California, and you travel from Northern to Southern California, there's these hills that you go through, and you look over, and if you go early in the morning, for instance, you might see a haze, and you can't see the mountains, but you know that they're there, right? So the sunrise plains, so it's like, that's where I want to be, That's what I believe in. That's where my predecessors went to. They went to the Elysian fields. They are great men, but it's a tender haze to me right now. So it could be something's obscuring his view. That's one way of looking at that. But another one is, you could think of it as he's not ready to join the heroes of old and pass it on to the next generation. They are there. They're over there in that, but that's what they are. They're on Mount Olympus. They're on the Elysian hills, but I don't care. That's not where I am right now. So I'm not going to focus on that. It's kind of a tender haze because I'm focused over here. He's still here where the bright skies blaze on the big today. So that's another way of thinking about it. He's not concerned with the past or the future so much as now. Another way of thinking about haze is, and this is relevant to, this is like maybe a more literal version or more concrete, specific version, is so not metaphorical or analogy. Haze means to drive while on horseback. Like he passed them on, and they chambered up through he hazed them and clambered up through the rocks. So one way to think about this last stanza is he doesn't care about potentials. He cares about actual. He doesn't care about the past. He doesn't focus on the past. He doesn't focus on the future. He focuses on building right now. The sunrise plains, the Elysian hills where my fathers are a tender haze. Maybe I'll join them one day. It's not my focus. And the sunset seas are gray. So where the sun sets, it's gray. I'm not concerned with it. But I stand here where the bright skies blaze. This is like the noon of your day, from noon to noon. Another way to think about from noon to noon is if you think about the life of a human as, dawn, noon, dusk, you're dead, right? Or, like at nightfall, that's the death. Like the birth of the day is the sunrise. The noonday is the middle of your life. And the sunset is the death. That's, I think, a better way of looking at this context. And the sunset seas are gray. But I stand here where the bright skies blaze. This is the middle of your life. This is the best time of your life. You got to build before you enter that tender haze and you're dead, right? Over me and the big today. What good to me is a vague maybe or a mournful might have been. So maybe I'll go into the sunrise plains. What good is that to him right now? What good is it to say I might go where my fathers are? He's focused on is building his own world today. Maybe he will, but he's not going to focus on. What good is that to a vague maybe? There's no clarity there. Or a mournful might have been. That's a kind of past focus. Like, I might have been there one day. I'm going to focus on my past and where I made mistakes. For the sun, S-U-N, wheels swift from morn to morn, and the world began when I was born, and the world is mine to win. So, all right. He doesn't care about potential. So we have a whole philosophy of life here, I think. We have a view of his fathers and where he came from, metaphysics. So what he has inherited from the world that he was born into. How he looks at that and what he is going to do with it. I'm going to take it and build more of my own, or of my own from scratch. Then he talks about his own moral behavior. I waste no thought on my neighbor's birth. While he plays it straight, I'll call him mate. And then he talks about, I dream no dreams of a nursemaid state. So now he's talking about how in his world, we're going to be working together, which is no nursemaid state, no welfare state. Nursemaid is a better way than saying welfare. Welfare seems more neutral. Then he talks about the potential of joining the Elysian fields, the hope of a better future. His hope is to fight for today. That's the difference. He's going to fight the strong. He just wants a little bit of hope to fight the strong for more. That's it. He doesn't want to fight everybody. He doesn't want to, get into wars with people he doesn't care about. His hope is not that I'm going to walk, literally that he's going to walk with his fathers, although that's not irrelevant. It's not literally that he's going to go to heaven, which is what Christians tell you, or that if he does proper behavior, as Islam tells you, and converts enough traitors or infidels, that you might go into heaven. Or one way of looking at jihad is killing them because they're evil. That's not what he's worried about. He's not going to be focused on this, spending his whole life worrying about getting into heaven. His heaven is here and now, because the world began when I was born and the world is mine to win. If you really accept that, and you really believe that there is nothing more than this life, or that this life is everything, is a better way of looking at it. That is a happy, good, benevolent, amazing view of the world. That this life is everything. That there is nothing after this. That when you die, that's the end. When you die physically, that's the end. And that makes this life beautiful. And if you've been following the Sunday morning poems I've been doing, you'll know that that view of life is absolutely critical to enjoying to the utmost the only life you have, this one. When you understand that death is the mother of beauty, the beauty that we live around us, the beauty of these books that I love so much, the beauty of, I'm going to go hiking in a little bit, the beauty of the world around us, that world is in my head. My head. When I meet somebody, hierarchically, I phrase them as they're someone I don't want to spend any time with. I hate that person. He's a waste of my time. I'm not going to even think about them. As Howard Roark famously says to his arch nemesis in the book, the arch nemesis asks him, so what do you think of me? Be honest. And Howard Roark answers brilliantly, but I don't think of you. And that's a great way of thinking about it, is he doesn't spend his time focused on morons or people who want to destroy him. So that's a hierarchy. That person literally doesn't exist, which is why it was such a harsh statement in that book, because you would think that someone who wanted to impinge on your life would exist. But Peter Ellsworth Toohey does not exist. Let me repeat that. Ellsworth Toohey in the Fountainhead does not exist to Howard Roark. So when Howard Roark dies, Ellsworth Toohey dies. Because it's his life. It's Howard Roark's life. That's the world. We build the world conceptually from scratch. Now, you can just do what Peterson says and accept all that has been given to you uncritically. Oh, that's not fair. He doesn't say uncritically. He's a very critical thinker of all of it. So you should think of it critically. I don't want to, attack Peterson for stuff like this. I really do like him. My point is that you can accept the religious dogma, or you can question it and come to your own value structure, which is what the Westerner does. You can accept this, Sunday morning going to church, or you can go to a Sunday morning poem church with me and kind of enjoy this and enjoy what we're doing now and discussing it. Maybe you can send me an email, kirkbarber@gmail.com, and tell me you like this stuff and check it out and tell me a poem you'd like to discuss on a Sunday morning. I would love to do that. So anyway, my point is that is part of what we mean when we're talking about I will not die. Or that is not part. That is what we mean by I will not die, the world will end. It is the world that will end. Because by the world, she doesn't mean metaphysically the world around us, which is why those people called her a psychopath. And this was their quote for calling her a psychopath is, I think if you literally believe that on some level that metaphysics is, this table, this mixer you can't see, this microphone, my shirt, this pen, that this is all brought into existence literally because of my conscious mind or a conscious mind, then the idea of you are going to die and all of that will be blown to bits and turned into nothingness is a psychopathic, because that's not what she means. She means that she, I think she was asked by Peikoff what he wanted, what she, the last year of her life, she's getting sick. She knew she was going to be dying soon at some point in the near future, as all people who get to a certain age know. Like when you get to a certain age, that this is it, right? There's no more after this. And so he asked her something like, what would you like me to do with this estate, these estate things, this like a particular thing about her estate? She said, I don't care. I'm going to be gone. The world, that her estate doesn't exist. So that doesn't matter to her. Now, one criticism people will always say, and I'll try to end on this, and I want to make sure I have this clear to people, is one thing people will criticize objectivists and atheists about is that they wouldn't care, if that's the truth, they wouldn't care what happened to their children. But that's not true. Like after they're dead, like, oh, I'm dead, I have kids, but who gives a shit because they die with me. There's some truth to that. But the other truth is that while you're alive, you do care about what happens to them afterwards. So if I don't have any kids, but I'm 32, let's say I'm 40 and I have a 5-year-old at that point. Well, let's say I get cancer and I'm dying. While I'm alive, I want to know that because I'm alive. So I want to know that I'm doing things for my 5-year-old, because I've taken on the responsibility. I love this 5-year-old. I want the 5-year-old to turn into a flourishing 25, 35, 45, 65, 85-year-old, right? I want them to have a great flourishing life. That's important to me while I'm alive. It will not be important to me after I'm dead, because by definition, after you're dead, nothing is important to you. You see nothing. There is nothing. You are nothing. So the world does end when you die. But while you're alive, all the values you have, the world lives, and the world will live forever when you die, because it's not that I will die. I'm infinite. The world's going to die. And that's when I pass from, when my eyes close forever. And so this criticism of objectivism isn't quite fair, that you have no care about your children. It's obviously not true, because while you're alive, they're your number one priority to the last day, which is how you should live. You should get the most out of every day. So you should want to build to a point where they will be by your side in the end. And I think that line by Ayn Rand really represents this poem, The Westerner. I will not die. It's the world that will end. Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed The Westerner and my little attempt to try to understand this poem and make it clear and converse with it. It's now 12:30, so I'll be posting this on my podcast, Poems for People Who Hate Poetry. You can like that on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you can find podcasts. So thank you, and I'll see you next time.